Welcome to Everything Co-op, bringing you information on how cooperatives can help improve your quality of life. This show is being sponsored by the National Co-op Bank, NCB. The NCB is dedicated to strengthening communities nationwide for the delivery of banking and financial services for the nation's cooperatives, their members, and other socially responsible organizations. For more information on the power of community ownership, visit ncb.coop. That's ncb.coop. Now stay tuned for your host, Vernon Oakes.
Good morning, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes. Welcome to Everything Cooperative this beautiful Thursday morning. We're in the Washington, D.C. area, and we're talking about cooperatives. And this morning, we have on the phone with us Mr. Brendan Martin. Good morning, Brendan.
Good morning, Vernon. How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing today?
I'm wonderful.
Great. You're the founder and director of The Working World. The Working World. The Working World. What is Working World, and why did you start this?
Well, The Working World is, the simplest way to put it, is a financer of cooperatives, primarily worker cooperatives, but other cooperatives as well. But you break that apart, there's a lot to talk about in there. Like, what is financing? How do we do it? How does it benefit cooperatives and support them? And then there's a lot to talk about within the cooperatives. But so there's a lot we could dive into there, but that's the short of it. And I started it because of the end of cooperatives, because of the importance of financing as the key pillar in our theory of change, to create a cooperative economy. And I could talk about our abiding belief in the power of cooperatives and how I got to that end as well.
Well, in doing a little research about you, I found out you were born in Washington, D.C.
That's true. George Washington Hospital.
GW, all right. And where do you reside now? Are you still in the D.C. area?
Only if you consider New York the D.C. area, which some do. Yeah, I'm up in Brooklyn, New York.
Brooklyn, okay. Okay. Brandon, I'm curious how did you get involved in the cooperative world? You said that you wanted to finance co-ops. How did you even learn about co-ops and get involved in this world? Well,
the way that I learned about co-ops, I guess the story goes a little bit back to even how I got interested in economics and the problems of the economy. At some point when I was young, my parents got divorced, and their lives started to follow pretty different economic pathways. And my mother really dropped a class or so economically. While my father, during his life, he kept kind of rising up in his income level and such. And I think that, one thing it's hard to do is, especially when you're a kid, is see outside of your economic situation. That's sort of normal. And you might not even realize, even if you're told it, you don't really realize what it means to be in a different economic situation. But being in two households that were different really helped to bring that out.
So wait, let me make sure I understand this. Your father's income started increasing, so his economics got better. Your mother started decreasing, so her economy got worse. Is that what you're saying?
That's true, yes.
Okay.
After their divorce, she got, yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And the impact, she was hovering on the poverty line a lot of my life, and yet trying to live close enough to, trying to be in the same school district as my dad was in for her kids. I have 3 other siblings. And that pressure of her financial situation, as a child, I could see it, the impact it had on my mother. And I think that gave me my first glimpse and my really, undying dedication to trying to solve the problem of poverty, of class struggle, of people living in that kind of stress and pressure and the ways that can affect their lives. So that got me really interested in economics and the problems of our economy and even the problems of economic justice.
Wow, interesting when I'm hearing you and feeling you, because I grew up in a household with a mom and dad. They never divorced, but my mother went back to school and graduated from college when I was 13 with 6 kids. My dad worked on a railroad, and if the economy was good, he had good work. If the economy was bad, there was no work. And most of the time when he worked, he would take his money and try to get the big boat, so he would gamble it. He always trying to get more and more and more. So it was always kind of interesting watching money flow and how poorly my parents managed money. So my look at it was also from a sort of growing up, looking at my dad's friends and how they managed money, and looking at my dad and how he managed money. Yeah, so I feel you. I got it. I got it.
Yeah. Well, it's really nothing. It's a very powerful experience as a child to look at the dining room table and see your mother and realizing she's trying to figure out how she's going to make rent and can't yet, and knows that the end of the month is coming soon. That was a really formative kind of thing to happen.
So you heard the saying, borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, and you have more month than money. Okay.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's
okay.
Right.
Well, okay. We grew up in similar backgrounds in different places, but okay.
Yeah. I mean, my background was complex. I also saw, I saw a lot of different pieces of the economy because my dad was in a different situation. So there's a time when it sort of felt clear to me that it didn't have to be that way too. That I could, and it wasn't to do with the underlying merits of my parents or they both had similar educational backgrounds, but the fact that happenstance could lead to her situation being so different. It seemed like it wasn't. There was no fate in where things ended. That the system was unintentional, but also maybe it could be changed. It really gave me that varied background I had, and it kind of feel to me palpable that, hey, this doesn't have to be this way.
That is so interesting because I'm African American, and so I had it that being black in America was one of the constraints. And I often wondered, my grandfather worked in the mines in West Virginia, in the coal mines. What would life have been like if we weren't African American and we didn't have racism and Jim Crow? Mm-hmm. So I thought of it from that standpoint, that it didn't have to be this way. And how was my father shaped such that he was always looking for the big boat to come in, this big ship, and not managing what he had very well. Okay, but so it didn't have to be that way. It was more of a global economics of black-white relationships in America.
Right.
Okay, and yours was looking at your mom and your dad's situation. Did you get any sense of how hard it was for women to make money in this environment? Also, the sort of sexism stuff that happens in America, was that a part of what it didn't have to be that way?
Yeah, there was definitely just people's prejudice, and there were decisions being made by employers that had to do with her being a woman, that had to do with her being a woman in her 40s looking for work. There was ageism of, that was had to do with her being a divorced woman in the early 80s looking for work, who hadn't worked in a number of years. That was sort of a very steep hill to have to try to climb. So it didn't matter if they had actually met in the same educational institutions, if they should have similar education backgrounds. They were then in a very different place. And so she was stuck there. So there was an element of it that had to do with prejudices of sexism, of ageism, against divorce at the time. But I don't know that I wasn't as aware of those things. They were sort of subtle. So I might have also naively felt like, hey, I could change this. I should study economics when I grow up and get into cooperatives. I don't think I realized just how hard a hill that was going to be to climb, that there was a lot more to do than just but sometimes it's good to have that naivete to get you to try something. And so now here I am 30 years later or something, still trying and working on the same problem.
Well, I'm excited that it's amazing how you have a problem early on and it causes you to get the education you need to try to understand it, that you had a sense of, I want to understand this thing. And then you start looking. So what are some of the kinds of lessons? All right, well, let's go back to studying economics. What's your study? Where did you go to school, or how did you study economics?
Well, it was in a high school that had a teacher who decided to not just teach the normal social studies, but taught an economics course. He managed to get away with that. So I got exposed to economics. And it was an interesting exposure. It wasn't a specific, say, technical part of economics we were supposed to learn because it was high school. He was kind of free to talk about stuff. And we read this book called The Worldly Philosophers. It showed the theories of Adam Smith about, which is at least now credited as being the underpinning theories for capitalism, although it's a lot more complicated than that when you look at it. Showed the theories of other economists from socialist economists, Marxist economists, had Marx in there, Saint-Simon, a bunch of others that, and it made it feel, having all these different people saying, what if we organized the economy this way? What impact would it have? It made it feel alive and with possibility. And that was a really good beginning point. And that's why when I went to college, I decided to major in economics. And that became, that was what my studies were focused on.
So where'd you go to college?
Wesleyan University in Connecticut.
Okay. And study economics.
That's right.
The two classes in economics that I had, the first one I didn't like. So I have a master's in math, and then I went back and got an MBA, and that's my first class in economics was in an MBA program.
Gotcha.
And it was all graphs.
Right.
And it wasn't based in hard math. I mean, they used math to try to get to but it was all assumptions. You put a whole bunch of assumptions together, and then you look at what the graph would look like with all of these assumptions. And growing up in math it wasn't so much assumptions, it was sort of facts. And then you took the facts together and you drew your conclusions. And so I got that if you change the assumptions, your graphs are going to change. And I didn't like economics behind that. When I didn't like all of the graphs, I didn't like the assumptions that went into it. I did like the macroeconomics where they talked about what happens in the plants and stuff. I did like that, but I would have loved to have gotten economics in high school. I think you were blessed to have somebody to do that talking and bring it down to a level where you could understand it.
Well, it's interesting, even your insight in that first economics course. I thought when you said, well, it was all graphs, it would have felt, these don't mean anything to me. They're just graphs. But actually the point is, you said, well, they might be logically coherent, but what about the facts that they're starting with, that are said are facts, and then they lead to the results in that. But are those really facts? That in some ways all this math of these graphs hides that there aren't usually facts that you're starting with in an economics thing. Those are choices or points of view, and then you say, yeah, but let me do some math on them and show some graphs, and then it seems like what is actually just a theory is truth. And that was a problem I had with a lot of economics. It was that it sort of, it tries to present itself as a science, and in the end is often used just to justify the current economic system we have, which isn't science. It uses the tools of science of graphing and math, but lays it on top of these often not well-founded facts.
Their assumptions.
The way it is now is normal.
They were somebody's assumptions, and then they laid all of this on when they wanted to make it into a science, and it was just based on sometimes faulty assumptions, perhaps, but somebody's assumptions, and that's why I didn't like it.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's super insight. I mean, luckily in that high school class I hadn't done that. That was why it was interesting. So even when I took, some of the intro classes I had were exactly that. They basically were saying, look, all you can have is the system of the market based around shareholder corporations that we have today, and this is why. And it was the least open-ended thing to study. Like studying mathematics had more it seemed more open-ended than economics. It was just studying the way that the world is, and that's it. But I still had that starting point of the economics course I had in high school, and then when I got into the upper-level courses, there was finally a chance to sort of poke around, and that's when I decided to write an undergraduate thesis on the study of what can economics do about the problem of poverty. What does it actually have to say about?
We're going to come back on that one. People. Brandon, we're going to take our next break, and then we're going to come back and talk about that. This is fun. I enjoyed it. We'll be right back.
Washington, D.C.'s News Talk, 1450 AM WOL and 95.9 FM.
Information is power. This is Vernon Oakes. The program is Everything Cooperative. We have Mr. Brandon Martin on the show with us this morning. And information is not power. I'm sorry. Information used, put action toward it, that's where you get the power. It's just like a gallon of gasoline. There's no sort of power in a gallon of gasoline until you strike something, get some kind of light it up some kind of way, and you get this power. And it could cause an explosion, or you could use it and then move a car. But this program is brought to you by the National Cooperative Bank to give you information. So if you use the information, then that's where you get the power to control your life, to control your family, control your community. And Mr. Brandon Martin and I are talking about that. And Brandon, I want to tell you a quick little story. At Penn State, working on a master's in mathematics, we had a class. I don't even remember the name of it, but this professor would come in and he wrote with his left hand. His right arm was, maybe he had polio or something in it. And he would start off with 2 or 3 definitions, and then he would create a mathematical system. And the room was full of blackboards, and he would go all the way around the room and end up with a complete mathematical system based on definitions. And he may start off with as 1 + 1 is equal to 3 as the assumption, and he'd define that and then create a whole mathematical system. The good thing about it, he allowed us to watch this unfold. And I got, Brandon, that systems are based on the foundation. The foundation is some definition, some assumptions. And so that's what we were talking before we took the break when I was in the economics class after the math stuff. And I would watch this stuff unfold, and I'd go back to the definitions, the assumptions. And they wanted to make this very rigorous economics, but based on perhaps faulty assumptions, faulty facts. And so the last statement you made before we took break was how the economics affect poverty and the definitions behind it. So I wanted to come back and talk about what have you found out on these assumptions about the economy and how it affects poverty.
Yeah, that's
big question.
Brain to tee it up with. Yeah, that's good. It's great that insight came to you in the first class of economics. It didn't hit me until a while later, and having that teacher. The math teacher show that's a powerful context. Because the problem you have, it's not made clear to you. Said, hey class, look, let me show you assumptions that are clearly false. Because they're false doesn't mean you can't make a whole system around them. 1 + 1 is 3, and yet I build a system on it. But a lot of times people are just presented the final system, and it's a lot of dizzying math. And rather than the complexity of the math helping, it actually obscures the faulty assumptions.
Right?
Yeah, and that's a. And you're like, well, I guess that's just the way it works. It has to work. It's too hard to dig into those assumptions. And there's a lot of that in the economics that I was taught at times. I mean, we were still, when I graduated from college, it was not that long after the Soviet Union had fallen down, and there was this idea that you can't really challenge the assumptions of the American economic system. It's unpatriotic to do. It's kind of dangerous. So we weren't supposed to do that. On the other side, I was lucky to. It was a couple years after the fall of the Soviet Union, and there were folks starting to look into, academic folks and policy folks starting to look into, okay, what else can we talk about now that we don't have to worry anytime we talk about an assumption for our economic system that's different than what we have now. It doesn't mean we're somehow the communist agitators, but we're in an unpatriotic way. But actually maybe we're even people who are patriotic because we want to make our system better. That started to be possible. It was just the window when it was okay to start doing that. And that's where I got to cooperatives. When I first started that quest, it was hard enough to challenge that the system we had wasn't the end. There could be more that we could do. That people weren't just poor because, well, I guess they didn't try hard enough, or that they ended up where they are in the system because of their merit. Or even if maybe sometimes it's unfortunate that people like my mom might have ended up, it wasn't merit, it was kind of chance, there's still nothing you could do about it. If you change the system, it would just end up worse. Those were the assumptions. There was assumptions, they call it the TINA assumption, TINA, or T-I-N-A, there is no alternative. And that TINA assumption was actually a leading one in economics study at the time. And yeah, I think you can see how that impacts poverty, to your question. Because if there's no alternative, there's no way to change. All you can do is maybe try to help the people in poverty, maybe try to give them a little education, but you can't change the system that causes the systemic poverty.
Boy. So if you got a woman that's 40 years old, divorced, there's no changing it. If you got a father that's African-American and has an 8th grade education and a World War II veteran, there's nothing that he can do. Just that's what it is.
Yep.
This Tina said, "Oh, I like this. There is no alternative." I like that you're bringing that up. I don't like that statement because I have it that there are other alternatives, and that's one of the things I've learned with cooperatives, which is a great leadway into how did you get into co-ops? Where did that come from?
It was late in that study of economics. Again, I was just driven by there's got to be an alternative. I don't believe that. We are people who can apply our brains to think about this problem. Maybe there's some ways our current system is better than things that came before, but why can't the next thing we come up with be even better than that? And certainly, why can't it be fair and more just? And so, most of the economics I study was just kind of explaining the system as it is, not what ways could you experiment. So I decided to take it upon myself my last year of college to do my own study. You could write a thesis as an undergraduate. And I took my project on what does economics have to say about the problem of poverty, and I just started looking into that. Even it took me half the thesis just to prove that it was even worth trying to answer that question because maybe there was an alternative. Like even proving, hey, there could be an alternative. It took a lot to do back then. But where it ended was in cooperatives. I managed to find a book that talked about the experience in Mondragon, Spain, where a small town created a small number of cooperatives that then flourished, and it became the dominant economic system in that town, where most people worked in cooperatives, and all the benefits that happened because of that, and the much lower equality, the extremely low rate of poverty, all these economic benefits that supposedly we couldn't get, they had gotten through cooperatives. So that's when I got that bug. That's when was that study of what does economics have to say about poverty that ended in look at the experience when a community dedicated itself to worker cooperatives, and look at what that could do to address this question of poverty.
The Mondragon, Spain, it was interesting that a priest rode into town on a bicycle and brought this idea.
Yep.
And was it World War I or after war? I think it was after World War II.
After World War II.
And so in this area, it's complete poverty after the war, just devastation. And he brought this idea, just an idea. And people bought this idea and used this idea, and everybody grew. Everybody flourished. They got their own bank. They got their own school. They taught cooperative. Yeah, I've learned about that since this radio program has been on for 4.5 years now. So I've learned a lot. I didn't know about Mondragon, Spain until this radio program. And it's fascinating. I'd like to go there sometime. So you got this. And what year is this now, your senior year in college?
This is about 1994.
So 1994, you got to know in college, your senior year. And the reason I bring this up, I told you about I got the master's in math at Penn State, and then I got an MBA out of Stanford. And that was 76, the MBA out of Stanford. And nowhere had I heard anything about a cooperative. Okay?
Yeah.
And the main thesis at Stanford was all decisions were what gives the stockholders the most profit, return on investment. Decisions were made on that, period. There was no other sort of consideration. That was the assumption. So you were in 1994. And that might have been the time I started hearing about co-ops. I started a property management company, so I started managing housing co-ops, and that was my introduction to co-ops. It would have been 1990. I started the company in 93, so 94, 95, I started hearing about co-ops. Okay. In another minute, we're taking our second break, and so the second half of this hour, I would like to get into talking about co-ops and what you've done. Can you tell us quickly in your thesis, in 30 seconds or so, what was your conclusion about poverty? What could economics have to say about poverty?
Conclusion was a lot, that there absolutely is an alternative. And if a small village with a priest and a bicycle could turn on its head the assumptions of the economy and make real, not theoretical, but results for people, that we as the richest nation in the world absolutely had all the resources we needed to also be able to try to create results like that.
We have the resources. The question is, do we have the will? We'll be right back, and we'll talk about that. Take our second break. Brandon, thank you so very much. Please don't touch that dial.
Washington, D.C.'s News Talk, 1450 AM WOL and 95.9 FM.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes. The program is Everything Cooperative. It's being sponsored by the National Cooperative Bank, whose mission is to support and be an advocate for America's cooperatives and their members. especially in low-income communities, by providing innovative financial and related services. And Brandon Martin is our guest today. He's the founder of A Working World. And Brandon, okay, can you repeat what you said right before your thesis showed that?
It concluding to the question, what does economics have to say? It has to tell us, though, to the problem of poverty, that the answer was a lot, that there is an alternative, that if people in a small mountain village in Spain with a priest who came in on a bicycle could muster up the resources and the will to create a system that was so different and had such dramatically powerful impacts for the impoverished people there, and had such low inequality and high economic justice, that we could too.
Low inequality and high economic justice. What I learned really early, Brandon, was that poverty does not discriminate. It doesn't make any difference if you're white, you're black, you're male, you're female, you're old, you're poor, you're big, you're small. It just doesn't make any difference if you're Christian or Hindu or Muslim. It just doesn't make any difference. Poverty can hit you and hit you hard, and it seems like once you're there, it's so very, very difficult to get out of it. And here comes co-ops. So you found about it, and what did you decide to do, and how did you start Working World?
Yeah, so that's condenses a good 15, 20 years of my history, because which is how things, again, if I'd realized how hard it was going to be to answer this question, maybe I wouldn't have been jumped in so enthusiastically. So sometimes naivete is a good thing. You said it earlier about knowledge, and knowledge not being power, information not being power. So I graduated with this knowledge there is an alternative. And there I am, a 22-year-old kid with that knowledge and no power, no ability to do anything about it. And action, that spark that could light that, took a lot more. So I thought, hey, this is great. We could, if we had cooperatives in the U.S., perhaps we could also address the problem of poverty and inequality. We could make pathways, opportunities for people like my mom, for people like your dad, to not get stuck in poverty. There's a lot of things to like about cooperatives in addition to, hey, it seems like an answer to poverty. It was also an answer that was really practical. It was an answer based on people working together with agency. It wasn't an answer from a giant government deciding to do things for people, like just handouts or something. But they had safety nets in Mondragon, very strong ones. But those are safety nets. And then they also had the resources publicly available for people to build their own cooperatives and build their way with their fellow people in that town, build their way out of poverty. So the fact that it was people being active and locally and in relation to each other in real organic relationships, not just like the state solving it on its own, that people could do this. The state of that, the government in that city provided you with the resources, but then you, with a group of people you got together with, cooperated to cooperate your way out of poverty by building a business that you owned. And that was really interesting. That was what grabbed me.
Cooperate your way out of poverty. It reminds me of Dame Pauline Green, who was the president of the International Cooperative Alliance. She said that co-ops brings people out of poverty with dignity.
Yeah.
And I've liked that. I also like this, cooperate your way out of poverty. And what you're talking about are the principle, the values of co-ops. Co-ops are based on the values of self-help. Self-help I like, self-responsibility, democracy, equality, equity, and solidarity. And in the tradition of the founders of cooperatives, cooperative members believe in the ethical values of honesty, openness, social responsibility, and, my favorite, caring for one another. So people with the tools of co-ops can bring themselves out of poverty with dignity, with confidence. Okay, so you got this knowledge. Then what did you do?
Well, then it was a long way. It was a lot of steps to try to create the working world. And maybe I should say why the working world, though, as I mentioned in the beginning of the show, the working world is a financer for cooperatives. It provides financing for mostly worker cooperatives, a business owned by its workers. Why? Why did I get into the financing side of it? Because that probably, how I started it, began with that question. When I realized, I got out of school and said, hey, I have this knowledge. There is an alternative. It's cooperatives. We can use this. And then I turned out knowing that didn't change anything on its own. I had to start doing that. And when I asked myself, okay, what can I build? What I got attracted to and focused on was the need for financing for cooperatives. And See, that it's an interesting phrase, self-help, that you used earlier. Because self-help, does that mean that there's dignity in helping yourself and building your own solutions? Absolutely. Does it mean that you should have to do everything on your own? That society said, okay, here, I'm going to dump you in the wilderness and now build your way out of poverty. Or, or society could it provide the tools and the resources you need? It provides us education, provides us roads, and the mail system, government. Why can't part of what it do is to provide other tools and to build your way out of poverty? And that's what they did in Mondragon. They had created a bank that was owned by the people in that town. And the simple version of it is that bank allowed any group of workers could borrow money with care and with planning, access capital that would be the start of their business or the growth of their business, so more people could be added. So they weren't just doing it on its own. They weren't just willing their way into a cooperative. They were together as a whole community financing the way into people owning cooperatives. So that's what got me. That's what drew me to say, okay, what I got to do is we need financing for people to do this, and that's why I started to create the Working World.
Okay. All right, so you got the knowledge that there is an alternative, and that's cooperative economics. And one of the tools that folks need to build a cooperative business is financing. Okay. Yeah. That's where the capital meets the worker. There is this point where they have to meet. You have to have the capital and you need the labor. And that seems to have been, from my little bit of knowledge, the struggle and this friction between capital and workers, and the capital has been winning in America. Matter of fact, in the world. That's why there's so much inequality now. The people with the money are, in the U.S., they're getting 57 cents of every new dollar made, and at least 43 cents for the rest of us to split up. So 99% of us have to split up 43% of every new dollar that's made. And so I've been talking about redistribution of wealth, but I'm not talking about the old wealth, the people wealth that I already got, because I never believed that I was going to get, or anybody's going to get 40 acres and a mule. And at the time, it was white plantation owners was not going to get blacks 40 acres and a mule. Anybody with capital is not going to give away their money. There's somehow greed seems to build in. So how do we then get, for every new dollar that's made, every new dollar profit, surplus is made, how do we get a bigger share of that to the workers? And I only see the cooperative model work in this case. I don't see another model. What about you?
Yeah, well, that's where, again, some of those first principles you learn in that economics course come back. And one of the things you said, the underlying assumption that you got in your MBA, you never were told about cooperatives, but you were told that there's this whole system designed around maximizing the return for shareholders. That's basic assumption. But there's even an assumption before that they don't talk about, which, how do you become a shareholder? Who are these shareholders? So we have a whole system, this whole economic system they teach you at your MBA at Stanford, which is to maximize return to shareholders. But who are these shareholders? They become shareholders because they already had the money. People with the money become the shareholders, and then the whole system is designed to maximize the return to those shareholders, which are the people who already had the money. So it's not a mystery of why the people who already have the money, a tiny group of people getting the majority of every new dollar created, because that's how the system is designed. And in a cooperative, it's not the people who bring the money that are the shareholders. A worker cooperative, the owners are the workers. So even though they have to have capital, the capital is not the owners. Essentially, you're saying if the formula for a business you just described is capital and labor coming together, some money and some people to build this thing. In our system, it says, okay, well, who's the owner out of those two? Well, the capital is. And the labor, the human beings involved, they just work for it. And when they're not good working anymore, you can get rid of them and bring in new ones and, give them as little as possible. I mean, human beings in our normal corporate structure show up as a cost, and you're supposed to lower costs. So you're supposed to lower how much you pay most of those human beings. Whereas in a cooperative, it changes that. It says, we might borrow some capital. We might get our hands on capital, but it's the human beings who are the owners. And when we don't need that capital, we pay it back, we get rid of it. We try to pay as little as to the capital as possible. The capital shows up as a cost, and the people are the bottom line. They are the owners.
All right.
That's what it taught me, and that's what. But how do you get the capital in that equation that will be subordinate to the people? That's why we made the Working World.
It's absolutely so interesting when you look at this friction between capital and labor. And the winners so far in America have been the capitalists. As a matter of fact, I think that's probably in the world, not just in the U.S. I don't care what the socialism, communism, whatever, for what little study I've done, it looked like the people in power ends up with the capital, ends up with the money.
That's right.
No matter what they say the underlying economic principles are. So here, just quickly, for those of you that may not have heard this before, a co-op there's basically 4 types of co-ops. And it depends on who owns and controls the business. And we've already talked about the worker co-op. If the employees own and control the business, then it's called a worker cooperative. And there are 7 principles that they work under. If the consumer, the people that uses the products or services, owns the business, then it's a consumer cooperative. And you have housing co-ops, you have credit unions, you have different types of businesses that's owned by the consumer. And the other 2 are purchasing co-ops, that people come together and they buy products and services together. And so they can get a better quality product, normally at a lower price, by buying in volume and bulk. And then they get folks that know those products in the cooperative business. And a lot of farmers and artists are now beginning to use that, coming together to buy what they need, if it's the warehouse or refrigeration or whatever they need, a tractor. And then on the other end of those businesses, there's a marketing cooperative that takes all the products that the farmers or the artists and whomever makes, and then they take them to different markets, and then they have the expertise, and they can get the products in the different markets, and sometimes they add value to them, like take milk and make it into cream cheese or butter or so forth. So those are the 4 basic types, and then you have all kinds of, like food co-ops, a lot of times started out as being consumer co-ops where the consumers own it, the business, but then they started becoming worker-owned cooperatives or hybrids. Both the consumer and the worker owns the food co-op. So there's a lot of them, but it gets to that the members control the business. They control it. Okay, so now you're starting the working world. Where did you start working world? We have a minute before our last break, and we're going to spend the last last section talking only about the working world.
Right. Oddly enough, it started not in Washington, D.C. or New York City. It started in Argentina because after getting all this knowledge and trying to figure out how to apply it and learning more, I studied normal business, studied finance. Then there was this economic crisis that happened in Argentina. The system melted down, and a bunch of workers took over their abandoned factories. So they said, hey, let's take them over and make them a cooperative. So suddenly you had hundreds of businesses run by their workers, but they owned the factory, but they had no money, and they didn't have the capital to buy raw materials often. And that was the opportunity I saw to say, hey, there's a system where there's a bunch of cooperatives now, and they need capital.
We're going to stop right here, and we're going to start back with Argentina and then move forward. We'll be right back.
Washington, D.C.'s News Talk, 1450 AM WOF and 95.9 FM.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes. The program is Everything Cooperative. We have Mr. Brandon Martin on the phone with us today from the working world, and he started his business in Argentina. So you want to continue there, Brandon? You had these factories, these workers took over their factories, but they had no money. So what did you do?
Well, what every fool does, I just thought I could do something about it.
Okay.
So they had this financial meltdown. Their whole financial system melted down, and a lot of people, the people with the money, the people who were getting the 53 cents on the dollar, most of them kind of left. They took off for a bit. They went to, and a bunch of the workers, the other 99% of people left there with empty factories that weren't running, and they said, let's take these factories over. That became a movement to take them over and start to get them running again. And a lot of times these workers had worked for 20 years in that factory, and they didn't want to abandon it, and they didn't have a choice. And so, but they didn't have any money even to buy raw materials. They try to scrap together little bits they have, and really, these very hobbled efforts to try to do this. So I had met people who had been down in Argentina for many years. First couple of years, this phenomena started in 2001, and by the time I went down there, it was 2004. And I talked to them about this background, this knowledge I had about cooperatives and the need for financing that will support cooperatives. And they said, this is interesting. You should talk to some more folks in Argentina. And I started having conversations with people down there. And before you knew it, they invited me to come down and said, let's start this thing you're talking about. Their difficult situation around just how much financial trouble they were in also meant that their currency had lost a lot of its value. So I managed to scrape together from different donors and others and some of my own savings about $50,000. And that actually was meaningful down in Argentina at the time. I could go to a factory and say, well, what do you need? You need raw material. A $5,000 check was often enough to buy the raw material they needed for that month. So with a little bit of money, we actually found that we could make a real difference for these factories that needed to buy their raw material, and that's what we began doing. We began to finance worker-owned cooperatives in Argentina.
$5,000 would give them enough to buy their raw materials for a month because of the exchange rate, I assume, helped. Yeah,
the value of their peso dropped to a quarter of what it had been. That would have been, saying, $20,000 only a couple of years before, and then all of a sudden, that was what it was worth, the equivalent. Not always for a month, maybe a week, maybe, different factories had different costs of raw material, but $50,000 was a meaningful amount of money to start with. So then when we managed to get together $150,000 and then $250,000, that small amount of money used well made a real material difference. We had factories from all across, around Buenos Aires, hours away, coming to borrow money from this makeshift system we started up.
Brandon, you're in Argentina. You're not an Argentine. You're either crazy or courageous. Somewhere in there.
Those words sound related, don't they?
$50,000, your money, and some friends or donors that put in the $50,000. Now because of the exchange rate, that sort of would have been worth like $200,000, maybe 2-3 years before that. So now you've loaned them money. So you said that a small amount of money used well. Okay. Cutting to the chase is, you got relatively poor people, working people, maybe middle class and Argentine people, but don't have an education, they haven't run a business before. They don't have capital, so they can't, most bankers, they only are interested in getting their money back. So they want to loan money with people that already have money. So you're loaning to people that don't have money. What has been your failure rate?
Well, yeah, we were working with businesses that would have, on any sort of test you gave them, they would have gotten the worst rating in the world, have been a bankrupt country run by with businesses with no money, run by just the workers from the factory floor. So any metric out there, with a banking metric, would have told us that we would have 98% failure rate. But the reality was we had 98% success rate, which blew us all away.
98% success rate. 2%
which is far
failure.
better than commercial banks in the United States making commercial loans to U.S. businesses.
So not only were you courageous, you were smart.
I'd say that was, hey, I'll take it. No, I don't. That was not it. I don't think it was. We worked hard, but I don't know if there's anything smart we did so much. The only smart part about it was being willing to question those assumptions. And we walked in there and we based our choices on opening our eyes and looking at the need and what the kind of financing we gave, who we gave it to. There was interesting things that came out of that. How can you finance in a way that actually supports people rather than just extracts money out? How can you be a financial institution? And there was a lot of insight that emerged from that. But the real heroes, the courageous ones, definitely weren't us. It were the folks in those cooperatives who paid us back and who were able to use their worker cooperative to create a life for themselves, to do that self-help. Because that's why 98% paid back. It sounded great that 98% paid back, but I should be clear that one of the ways we decided we had to finance was that they never would pay us back unless they were successful too. We weren't going to get paid back just because they had to sell the roof or they sell their assets or just go out there and get another job and pay us back. We were only going to get paid back because the money they borrowed was useful and successful. They had made money from it, which that makes the bar really high to get paid back. But so that meant in 98% of the cases, those worker cooperatives who borrowed the money were successful. That's extraordinary. But I think that's the power of cooperatives, because each one of those businesses had workers in it where there's always a problem in a business. Every day there's a new fire to put out. But each one of those businesses had people ready to put that fire out. That whole team of firemen and women that came in every day because they all owned it, and they all wanted to see it succeed. So we knew we gave money to one of those businesses. They had every single worker in there was motivated to find the success. That would then mean we'd get paid back, and that's why it worked as well as it did.
I'm going to need another hour, buddy. This is nice. So you went from Argentina to where? Where's the next stop?
I lived in Argentina for many years. Lived there for about 7 years. The organization there is still thriving and does a lot of work down there. Doesn't have as big a capital base as it should, but does amazing work with what it has. There was a branch opened up in Nicaragua, and then in the United States. I say, why Nicaragua? And why do we open up another branch? And it's this is no alternative. It's powerful. It comes and creeps back up on you because when I was going down to Argentina, people said, look, this idea of financing is never going to work because you're financing these worker takeover factories. These people have never run a business before. Argentina's bankrupt. Their economy's it's never going to work because it's these recovered factories. And then it works so well, so then people look and say, oh, well, wait a minute. What I meant to say was it only worked because of these recovered factories. It won't work anywhere else. You're not going to be able to do it. So we said, okay, let's see if this works in Nicaragua and then in the United States. And it turned out we had the same success rate in both of those countries.
So how does people find you if they want to be a investor into Working World or if they need to borrow some money for a cooperative? How would they get a hold of you?
Well, if you want to borrow, you have to be a cooperative. You have to have a cooperative idea business. You can find us at tww.org or theworkingworld.org, O-R-G. The way we give capital that is actually beneficial to people rather than extracts money is we have to be close enough to be in relationship with you. We don't give passive money, but it's active. We make an active relationship with you. So you have to be in the greater New York area or in an area where there's a partner of ours. In Baltimore, there's an organization called BRED, the Baltimore Roundtable for Economic Democracy. They have many cooperatives that have come to them and borrowed money. And BRED, B-R-E-D, they come to us and borrow money from us. So if you're one of our partner organizations, you can come and borrow. You can borrow through them. And we can help direct you if you reach out to us. Now, if you want to invest, all you have to be is a human with a good moral conscience. There's a lot of different rules for how you can invest. But you can donate. Anybody can donate right away. And if you're interested in putting in money, it's not a donation. There's ways you can do that depending on your financial situation. And, we can talk about that too. You just reach out to tww.org, look at ways to donate, see if there's a way you could even, put money in. And then also, if you want to try to get money from the organization, if you want to borrow, that's where you go, tww.org.
The Working World, tww.org. So if you are wanting to start a co-op, if you are a cooperative and you want to borrow money, go to tww.org. And if you want to donate money to help working people start a business or grow a business, a cooperative business, then you can go to tww.org. And I'm going to be going there to see about investing some money. I like what you do, and I like the results that you get. 98% return is great, but we only have another minute. Can you tell me what you mean about extract? You only take money back, or they pay you back when they make money, and we only have a minute?
Well, the people in Mondragon say that capital is supposed to serve people, and that's the idea of a cooperative. A worker cooperative, it's the benefit, the bottom line is the people, and the capital is just the way to get there. So when we give a loan, it can only get paid back when the business does well. You don't take people's stuff. You don't take people's money they already had. It's like an investor, except that the workers still own the business. So that's the way we give capital. It actually works out. We can stay solvent. We don't end up being the most profitable industry in the country, the way our financial sector is.
Thank you.
But we end up staying above water and allowing the worker cooperatives to be profitable. So
thank you, buddy.
Our finance is totally different. Thank you.
We got to go. We're going to have you back on because I want to hear the examples. But everybody else out there, have a wonderful cooperative week, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Washington, D.C.'s News Talk, 1450 AM WOS and 95.9 FM.